excited because this is the first episode of this ministry process, and I get to have Paul Bane, Mindful Christianity Today. Pretty much you're my best friend for about 14 years now. Wouldn't you say? Would you say I was your best friend for about
Well, you're right up there, pretty
right up there,
pretty close to the top.
Oh, so you have worked as a senior pastor in churches for many years, most notably the church where I'm currently the senior pastor at New Hope Community Church. You were the previous senior pastor before me for how many years?
Roughly 26 or 7 years before we made that transition.
Yeah. So
Long time.
our relationship began because I've been now here at the church coming up on 14 years. And our relationship kind of began. I remember back when I first got a phone call from you in it wasn't, maybe not early 2006, but it was like mid 2006. Do you have any recollection of that conversation or what was going on at the time when we first kind of began our relationship?
I think we had zeroed in on a couple of prospects and things, and we came back to think about this guy in Chicago. And there was several that thought, you know what, he's got a lot of potential. And so what I do remember, though, once we got you here was the impression that I had of your gifting and your ability to relate to, your musical ability, and also your Sarah, you're one of your best assets, Sarah, your wife.
Oh.
But we had some very honest discussions because we'd been through a tough time and realized that you had the ability to get and work through and would be able to deal with a tough situation, which I actually said to myself, if he comes, not that you're crazy, but it was a tough period. And so it was one of those moments that I knew you had some stuff in you because you were willing to take it on and come. And so that's what I remember most.
And at that time, it was a youth ministry position that you all were filling, and we were talking to that. One of the things that was funny in that whole process was, as you and I talked, I said, one thing you never have to worry about is I'm never going to be a senior pastor, so don't ever worry about that aspect of a youth minister trying to take over the senior pastor position. And I think at the time you're like, well, that's good to hear, And so that's what became so funny years later when you kind of started thinking about transition and what it looked like for you in your next phase of ministry, and which probably began when did that first start?
So when you came, I would have been in my early 50s, which I had somebody tell me that at 50 years old that I ought to be in the prime of whatever I'm doing. And so I was at a place that I realized that the church was getting older through the times that eventually that my day would come, that I would be in a position that would not be able to be as effective and relate to younger people. And so I probably was starting to think about that in my 15 years ago. And so roughly, and so I saw that as I began to think, I wondered, how could this work out? That I could maybe even stay in the church, that I wouldn't just die in the church, that I would be able to stay effective. And so I saw you and I realized that I thought you had a lot of potential, that you were gifted at what you did. And so I really kind of just thought in the background whether or not you'd be the type of person that could walk in. And we're talking about transitions because not being in a denominational church, we didn't have the limitations of having to start over or to bring somebody in. But ultimately, there's a lot of things that are also not good because you don't have other candidates or people that would naturally come to fit in. So I began to think about how this transition possibly would look. And I thought about you, that the first characteristics, and you joked about the fact that you never wanted to be the senior pastor. And because you never tried to take the senior pastor's position or role or take over the position, you were always in the back of my mind that he had the characteristics and the qualities of someone who could serve, that you were definitely a David in regard to Saul, that you respected my authority, respected my position. And so I began to entertain the thoughts of what this might look like. Never fully grasping what it would be today or what that process ended up a few years back of letting you come in and me step aside, and where we're still friends today and that we're able to do ministry. So that was partly my journey of coming to grips with my life, because I had been involved from 1975. I left the University of Arkansas. I was going active duty in the Marine Corps as a second lieutenant. And my commissioning physical, I was disqualified, so I ended up coming to Middle Tennessee for 2 years to be on the Middle Tennessee State campus. Spent 2 years in ministry. That was kind of the eye teeth of cutting it and getting started, feeling like I might be a pastor or have that calling. Would go back to Oklahoma. I knew I needed a seminary degree, and went back where my family were from, and spent 10 years in a Free Methodist church. Started a church, which is crazy at 24 years old to start anything, but started with 6 families and lasted about 10 years, and then made the transition here in 1987. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, I had been a lot of years in ministry. The truth is surviving ministry. The truth is of being able to still be in touch with God and with being effective, fresh and alive. And so that process was at least, even when I was turning 50, was the idea who could take and where I would end up.
Right. And it's so interesting to me because in this day and age, in the church world, when there's so much talk about transition, a senior leader, senior pastor transitioning out and replacing, there's lots of stories of senior leaders who hold on for too long and they don't turn loose of something and they don't want to turn it over to someone. You and I have talked before about a lot of times you see senior leadership transition where a father passes it on to a son, and you're frequently about that. But we're not hearing a whole lot about what you and I went through, like this situation where you identified someone on your staff who you felt God was leading you to a place to go, okay, if I step out of this, we could turn this over to him. And I just think that's such a commendable thing, because you were in a place where you said, I don't know, I'd like if you could talk a little bit about, like, were there things you say, well, there's other things I'd like to do maybe in ministry, or was there any of that at play?
I think that I realized that transition, or to be able to make that change, is that I had already begun to experience the mindful Christianity thing. Is just something that came about after really the senior stepping down from the senior role position. But there was already things in me that had been working spiritually in my life to say, I've got to have my own bearings. I've got to be able to have a relationship with God, not based around the church, but just a personal. And part of that relationship and the spiritual walk that I was on was basically learning to let go, learning to turn loose, and go against everything that the American culture, this whole idea of being the center of attention. And so you fortunately, if you live long enough and you survive, you come to a place you begin to say, I've done all these things, good, bad, indifferent, and that you say, there comes a time that it's all right if I step away from it.
Yeah.
And that's a decision that many men and women, in whatever the role, are unable to turn loose of. So that was rather unique in regard to the fact of, as Henry Nouwen would call, befriending your own death and dying before you die. And so part of that process was dying to the need for recognition, dying for the need of control, dying for all those things that goes against the grain of anything. But I found it is really the essence of spirituality, is learning how to turn loose and trust in God, which we all say we do.
Yeah.
And so we took those steps, and probably we might have moved a little faster than we thought when we made this transition and when we stepped up to it. But essentially, I saw it as a place I would take a back seat. And part of that, and I think the biggest struggle and what we came to understand, and we do understand, is that when I made the decision that I was going to step down and turn it loose, I don't know that I fully understood now, looking back as we talked honestly, of what that truly meant. But I had a concept in my mind. If I was to remain at the church, I had to be totally supportive of you, and that I could not I could not doubt what you did or second guess it. I had to be fully supportive. And in that process, that was something that, well, first of all, just a little side comment. The moment that we made the idea that you would come in and we took a year of transition where you took my place.
We had a year behind the scenes
yes,
where I was.
And I realized after about a month or two, this is great. I don't have to worry about anything. I mean, this is, maybe I need to be in this role, but I realized that we were in a position that you were going to take over and I would take a back seat. So in that back seat, I did one time, I thought about it when I talked about, do I need to preach anymore? And I think I've counted up one time that I had 6 months of talking as far as Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, all the lessons I'd taught, that I had done 6 months of literal, I could start speaking right now. And I said, when does it come time that it's time for somebody else to come in? And most of us would say never. But anyway, that's really the transition of saying, I have somebody here that is capable, that is has all the characteristics of leadership, has the youth, has the vitality, but also is willing to try to take this step with me and trust me of turning it loose. And so that was something that it was very healthy. And the truth is that part of the transition is, I think that you have to have, and I think if a church was going to do a transition in a larger church or whatever the church, is that we did something we did it for literally a year. You took it and you made a decision whether or not you wanted to take the job.
Yeah. And I think it'd be good, since we're talking about ministry process in this, and I think a lot of people who will watch this and looking at it from an idea of how do they go about a transition, or how can they pass leadership from one to the other. And we're coming at this from a unique perspective where you're the one who passed it on, I'm the one who came in, and they both presented challenges that I think looking back on, you go, well, I didn't anticipate it. That part would be that difficult. But I think it'd be good in the process of it to talk about from my perspective. So I came here in 2006, here being New Hope in Brentwood, Tennessee. And around 2010, if you go back in our memory banks there was a kind of an opportunity I had to go to do youth ministry in another place. And so we sat down and just kind of started talking about that. And that was where it was like the first seeds planted of going, well, hey, I kind of see this senior pastor thing down the road. We didn't have a date or timelines or anything like that. But the thought was, how about go to seminary?
Yep.
Get some classes, get some things. Well, that classes for me turned into, I got a master's degree in theological studies, completed that. And so then 3 or 4 years, it was 3 years later, after 2010, that then we sat down and began talking through this behind the scenes,
what this looks like,
and what a transition would look like. And I think at that time, then I think we were both probably watching. I think you probably were watching it from a perspective of going, can I trust?
Exactly.
And because you said then for me it was, do I want?
Yes.
And you kind of spoke to this a little bit already. What was something in that process when just looking at me? Was it really? I mean, that would be very difficult to watch someone else be doing something that you, and it's not a family member, it's someone you're turning it over to. You've been doing this for 24 years at that point. I don't remember exactly when it was.
At this church, yes.
And now you're turning that, like, how difficult was that?
I think that it was somewhere along the line. We talk a lot about faith and trust in the kingdom of God and Christians. There comes a place that you have to take a step, and you have to trust your instincts and believe that this person has the giftings. And you'd already proven yourself in many ways in the sense of your, and I cannot get this. This is something that would have been a non-starter. The non-starter would have been if I ever had thought that you were out from my job, or you thought, that you were going to do anything that that would be a non-qualifier. So you were literally an example of Christ as you served, you were faithful. And so that was a characteristic that I knew that you had as a leader that would ultimately come to a place. And of course, we had utilized you preaching and a lot of your giftings, and you were a hard worker, and you were now you were in your late 30s when at the time, which is
Now I'm an old man.
now he's an old man, but you were at the stage that if you were going to make that decision of whether to do it or not, is something, it was time for you. And I felt that it was something that, and the big thing I understood, and this is something that ministry-wise that only senior pastors, other people on staff might understand it, but there's nobody that understands what it means to be the guy that the buck stops with you. And that was the part for me that I was a little concerned about, is that you were being thrown in some ways to the wolves to what real ministry, even though there's a certain amount of it, and there's a baptism of fire that would take place and would have to take place.
Yeah, and I think I could speak a little bit to that, because it's when being a part of your staff at the church, and I would hear you say that before, and I would think, I mean, come on, really, there's really not that much of a difference. I mean, we're all doing pastoral ministry here. It's kind of the same thing. And then becoming the senior pastor made me go, oh, that's what he's talking about. This is what that island feels like.
Yes.
This is what he was talking about in all those moments. And there's just things that you can tell someone something, but you're just not going to feel it until you actually find yourself in that senior leadership position. The buck stops here position.
And the reality is that everybody that serves, basically, except for your staff members, are all volunteers in the church, and all the people that, so you have no real control. And if you're a pastor and you have like in ours, and there has to be an affirmation vote, which in our Constitution doesn't vote on the pastor, but it's the one position that you have to be if you were in a denominational church and that congregation votes on you. You got to have 80 to 90% support you. You're in trouble.
Yeah.
So we live in that kind of a fishbowl of trying to, and people vote every Sunday by whether they come or come back.
And I think that's why it was so important for me when I became the senior pastor, that because I know there were times when probably decisions I made or things that we carried out that you probably sat back there and thought, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Or, that's not very wise. And I don't know if you thought that out. We would have times when we would get together and talk a little bit. And if it came up, you would, if I asked, you would share different things. There was a growing season in that. But it became so important for me that you were supportive, because one of the things that we worked out was that you were going to stay on staff. You were going to step back and work in a pastoral care position.
And that's a key, because for me personally, I was getting to now do the ministry that I always enjoyed, because all the rest of the preaching and all that aspect of it is called the administration, the work and all that. And so now I could focus on the hospitals, and not every pastor has that calling. So I had an outlet, a natural outlet, to be able to continue to serve, and did that for quite some time. So there's a lot of uniqueness in whatever you do.
But and those things were able to happen because never once did I feel like you and I were in some sort of competition, that as you were stepping out, and if you were to have someone come to you and say, hey, I kind of liked it when the way you did it a whole lot better. There was never a case where you were going, well, I kind of agree with you. And, it's so ripe. It's both parties. Whenever you do transition the way that we did it, it's a challenge.
Absolutely.
And you get hit with those questions or those comments or whatever it may be. And that support, and understanding the position and knowing that, hey, for me, you knew Josh needs to make sure that he knows I'm on his side and supporting him.
That's the one thing that if a pastor knows anything, or a leader, whoever it may be, there's that part that says, I'm behind them 100%. That's all you can be, as far as to, you did throw out to me a couple times, says, now before I do anything really stupid, please tell me. In other words, and that's kind of. But I knew that you had to live and experience it, and that first of all, the last thing you'd want is me to come in here and say you should have done it this way or that way, because I think one of my standard answers is I'll give you an answer, but I'll guarantee you that won't make it right, and that I've learned that. So you're going to have to learn this on your own. But I think there is a certain amount after a period of time that there is a natural stability to the church and things with my presence just quietly in the background that gives support to you in whatever you're doing. And as I said in the past, anything that you really wanted to do, I would quietly put my support. But really, to be truthful, once you became the senior pastor, you're the leader. I mean, you are the leader. Now it took for you a time to probably process that, especially with me here. But there is that part that is a cohesiveness, and really the transition is that you were not coming in and making a major radical change to kind of where the church and the feel of the church and the character of who we were as a church. So that was the reason that you could sign on to it too, because you were and that's part of the DNA, which is one of the hardest things is that, in all truth, to hire somebody from the outside in a church today, you have about a 50-50 chance of making that work. And so a church that goes out and gets the wrong person, then you're back at a position, you may have a situation where you're going to be lucky to survive.
Right.
So we already had negotiated that, is that Pastor Josh was known by everybody, and totally important. And
and it became important because, and you knew this going in when we started the transition. You knew as far as ministry, where ministry as a whole was going into the future, the things that we needed to do as a church. We were going to be doing some renovations in the church. We were going to be doing new ideas, new vision things in the church. And things that you had identified in me probably a little earlier on that you thought you're the one who can carry those things out.
To be honest,
you know?
Your worship ability and that I could sing songs and lead worship if I had to, as far as and nobody would listen. But your giftings, and that's where we're unique, and just the things that I came out of a different generation, so. Yeah, I was looking to you as your ability in worship, which I've always told you I thought is one of your strongest giftings is leading worship, and that I don't think in fact, I don't know of anybody that I would prefer to listen to lead worship, but there is, and that's anywhere. But that was part that you had coming into the job or into the position that could make a difference in an area that I really had a feel for it, but not like the intimacy of understanding all that dynamic. So, and just like all the things about the building and those sorts of things, your giftings of presenting the facility and all those things, which, to be truthful, in 1977, the first church, and we built a building, is that we had a mimeograph machine for the bulletins. We were lucky to have anything. We were lucky to have an overhead projector for a projector, and then a piano that didn't sound real good, and maybe so all the changes that have occurred, you were fit more for it than any time. And the truth is that I'm somewhat of a miracle. For myself, I feel like a miracle. I'm glad I'm a miracle that I survived as long as I did in one church, because of the whole idea of change and being fresh, and that. And that to me is what you brought to the table, and the creative ideas, because it's just so important in our culture today.
Well, and so I appreciate you saying all those things, and it's easy to look back and have these glowing remarks, but there was also on my part, I think I can volunteer and share with you that I made plenty of mistakes along the way, and I think in any kind of a transition process, understanding in advance that it's not going to go perfect, and there's going to be times when feelings get hurt. And one of the things for me that I did when we did this whole year behind the scenes of me being in leading the staff meetings and the elder meetings and all that stuff, our congregation knew that we were up to something, but they didn't know like behind the scenes that, hey, this was kind of something that was going on. And then we were going to bring it to the congregation and say, do you all affirm this, And they ultimately did. But in that affirmation process, when we made it known to the congregation, that's when, the members of the congregation had to make a decision. Are they on
Yes.
board with this or are they not? And one of the things that I've learned over the years, whenever you make a change on a staff level, especially the senior pastor level, it takes people up to 3 years to figure out if they're going to be on board or not. They can think they're on board in the beginning, but then over time you see, okay, this isn't the same thing. I remember someone had come to me immediately and they said, "This is so great. We're excited to have you as a senior pastor. Don't change a thing." And I thought, oh, okay. I had someone else who came to me, someone who, respected person, and just said, I just think you're going to destroy this place. I thought, well, that was pretty honest.
They may have told me that sometime too. So
yeah, right.
That's all right.
So I think, but my point is then what it kind of created in me, and that's going to happen.
Yes.
You're going to get comments like that at any church that you go to or that you lead. But what it created in me, and the fact that you and I had gone through this transition, was this subconscious thing of going, I have to prove myself. So anytime something happens that's worthy of proving them wrong, I need to mention this. And so a mistake that I made and a few times in that process, and I don't know if you remember this or not, is I would sometimes make these grandiose statements that say, this is the best it's ever been. The finances are this, and that's the best it's ever been. And this, when the truth of the matter is, it wasn't. It maybe was I don't know why exactly I would say it, but I would lose track of thinking that may be hurtful to you or your family or whoever. And maybe I need to make sure I'm checking what I'm saying a little more before I just go ahead and make these large statements. But that was part of the process of us going through learning
part
what
of
we were
it
doing.
is your exuberance, and yeah, maybe there was those things that that was one little thing I just told you about. I think one time, just to guard yourself, but make sure that whatever you're saying, because in the ministry, what you say will be used against you. It will be documented. It's on tape or whatever. But there's also that part of your exuberance and which I had also when I was younger, to state the good parts and those sorts of things, because if you don't have that, then you're not worth your salt. I mean, you were, but you had to live and learn, and I think that when I think about the process, and you think about, well, should we have done it over 2 years? Let you do it for 2 years, and then of course most pastors don't last for 2 years in a church anyway. But in all reality, but that year was a time that. And it was, you were thrown to the things that you had no concept what you would deal with, but because of that, and nobody is ever used in the kingdom of God worth anything that has not been broken and been recognizing that if I survive, it's because God did it. If I'm successful, it's because God did it. Yeah, I have some gifts. I'm blessed that I've done some things, and yes, I've got I suck it up, and if I will plow right through it, and I will get through it, and a lot of it, not necessarily flesh, but just that mentality that I'm going to survive this and do what needs to be done. And that's what your athletics, your background, and some of that is that, and that's where I just had to let you, I never really ever doubted that you would survive it. Never. I knew I was always in the background, and I jokingly say I was thinking, well, I hope he does, because I don't have to take this thing back over to find somebody else. But that reality there of you having to, as you said, and that first year or two, I mean, when I had given up preaching only 35 Sundays or 40 a year, where I had for years 47, preached every Sunday. So I did miss that part of the pulpit. Now, any man or woman or anybody in leadership who does not like the limelight you've got to be something wrong. And even though
You're partially there because you somewhat crave the limelight.
Exactly.
Right.
You so the first year was tough as you did things and it coming to full of what this actually meant. So, but still, I was my stress level. Charles McGowan, Dr. McGowan, said this just before we made the transition. He looked
And
at
he's our apostolic counsel, someone who was advising us in the whole process.
And very great knowledge. And he looked at me and Kathy and I at dinner probably a month or so before, or maybe right after we'd made getting ready for the transition. And he said, "This will probably take or save 10 years of Paul's life." And I thought at the time when he said that, "Nah, you don't know me, Charles. I can take anything." And that I've survived the ministry and all those sorts of things. And that, and then after.
Well, I'd like those years back because you took them off my life.
because that first year, part of that missing the pulpit was, man, I think I might have added 20 years to my life because of the stress level. So where ministry became not necessarily, never was fun, but the ability to do the things. So in that regard, that was the positive in that. And so, as I jokingly told you, and you don't hear me this on the membership of the church when it comes out, the new deacons and elders and all the leadership and the votes on the church, I don't even look at it. I don't vote. I'm so in the background.
Released from
I'm
it,
released from all that.
Yeah.
I trust that. That's been that way probably the last 2 years or 3. And then, so there's an honest confession.
Yeah.
And because I trust the leadership, I trust you, and that's when I walked away.
Yeah.
That ultimately we have to trust, and we never know what the outcome's going to be.
And I think you and I have come to a place over the course of now 14 years of having a relationship with each other that, we could sit here now and say, hey, it's always been good times and all, but the truth of the matter is we've had times when it wasn't. I don't think either of us looked at each other ever. We didn't ever dislike each other, but we had probably disagreements over time. I've even shared with the congregation that there was one moment where when you were the senior pastor, had to say to me as a youth guy, hey, listen, if you're just not happy here, then just go somewhere else. Leave.
That is leadership. Yeah.
And that stinks to have to say that, especially if you even at that point had thought that there was some kind of a future that might be there. But at the same time, we're afraid, I think, sometimes to say those things to people, when I think the result of that was it made our relationship stronger.
Yes.
So we don't ever sit here going, well, we've never been real with each other. I mean, there have been real conversations.
No.
You know?
And in fact, that time that happened, you were in the process of looking at something, and I knew that ultimately we all have to make decisions.
Right.
And so all I was doing, because did I want you to leave? Absolutely not. Was I in a place that is, if God's in control, and what you know as a senior pastor now is that you can't control anybody, but you can tell them what you think. But also it was, hopefully at times we do say some things that will stir something in someone to get them to think and think what they want. And that was the whole purpose, but it's not comfortable. Yeah. And so,
and I think in the nature of, now that I look back at that time and being in the chair that I'm in now, I don't know that you intended it this way, but that's also just one more part of a test in the process of going, can someone receive constructive, whether it's criticism, or can someone receive when they're being called out on something? And can they accept that? Can they move past it, and can they grow from it? And that's part of it. Because one of the things when you talk about the idea of moving into transitioning into a position, there were so many parts of it that I did not see the difficulty in at the time. One was being a part of a staff and then being elevated to the senior leadership position in that staff, that I didn't understand the difficulty that was going to come from that, which was going to come from that.
And that is a reality that some churches and denominations ask a voluntary resignation from staff members before a new person comes on.
Okay. Yeah.
So those are some of those issues that makes
right.
it tough, because here you are,
Yeah.
then brought into a position, even though everyone was on board with that. It still is. It's,
So you can see,
you
yes.
become the boss of people who are now
Right.
Yes.
So that becomes a challenge, and then also just in the whole process of how that changed even relationships with friends that I had in the
yes.
church. That where hey, before you were
just
this guy,
and
now
now-
you're, and you don't want to say you were just a youth guy or you were just this, but the fact of the matter is now being moved out of a position where you go, well, hey, I don't have to worry about that. I don't make decisions, to being one of the decision makers. It changed the dynamic of relationships, and I didn't realize that. And it got me. I think I had said this to you even at one time. I said, "Boy, it would have been easier just to start a new church somewhere than to actually take over the leadership of an existing church."
Yes.
So transitioning, it's not in ministry is not for the faint of heart.
No.
By
No,
any
this is not.
stretch.
No, this is not. This is something that it took, and I'm not anybody. I'm different in some degree. I have an ego. As my wife would say, you're the most self-confident man I've ever met. But there was a part that there is a place in the kingdom of God that you learn to surrender. And I came to that age and we started that process at about 60, 59, 60. And so there was that part of me that basically, and that no transition. And that's what in life, we think that, well, if I go somewhere else or if I start something I will tell you, I started with a church of 6 families that I learned I didn't know any of the families, and that wasn't any cakewalk either. So there's
Right.
there's always positives and negatives, and it's how you adjust to
Yeah.
it and how you deal with it. And I think part of that is the ability to be honest. And I think for the first couple years, in fact, I went back to a back office, a little cubbyhole that was back at the time we still had a daycare. No, I don't know if we can't even remember. I think we did. And so I was back in an old office, and I knew it had a little bathroom in it. And I was clear at the other end of the building, and nobody even saw me. And you were doing your thing. And so I think in some ways I would have liked to have a little bit more input or been a little bit able to talk a little bit more
right.
and just to bounce stuff. But I think you needed that distance, and I still don't know if you were worried that I might say you need to do something or do it different.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, with time, the relationship that I foresaw became that relationship, because we had that goal, is that now I sit down with you and talk about things over the last few years that we spend, you'll bounce stuff off of me. And as I always tell you, well, I'll give you my opinion, doesn't mean anything, but that's the part of the ministry part of the relationship that I really enjoy, is just to be supportive and to, let you, how you're dealing with stuff, and just to be supportive. And
Yeah. And that was part of the process. And I think in both of us trying to come to grips with, okay, who are we now
yes,
in this? Because our relationship had changed a little bit. I mean, it wasn't an intentional, hey, go to the other end of the building, but it
no,
could
I
have
made
been
that decision.
it could have just been an insecurity in me. But one thing I think is important as we finish this up is, you have made this awesome move that you built this mindful Christianity today now over the last couple years, and it's something you really poured into. It really is an extension of where your preaching was going before you stepped down from the senior pastor position. And then you've just kind of taken it and gone to new levels with it. And now you're in this new season of this online ministry that is blossoming.
In kind of closing is that little did I have a clue what I would do after the transition. But I'm at the age I should think about slowing up. And so all of a sudden, ministry, if you do ministry and you care about people, there is something that you will do, paid or unpaid, to try to help people. And the biggest thing that I had dealt with, and really, as I've shared, part of that transition, of being able to make that transition, I'd done a lot of personal work of turning loose of things and the big thing is solitude, how to get quiet, how to quiet the mind, how to actually go away and get along with God. And so I started that about 2014 or 15, and my son, how to be mindful, how to concentrate on the presence of God, how to live in the moment, how to fully, understand who God is, and let's be frank. There are pastors who are committing suicide. There are friends of mine who have committed suicide. By the grace of God, that's not anything that ever was a subject that broached, but I realize that so many men and women are in ministry and they're tormented. And so I had come to a place of learning how to basically go back to even the monks of the 5th and 6th century who went out the desert just to get along with God, to be quiet. And so that's something that grew to a Facebook page. My son even and started blogging and doing that. So that became my outlet without preaching. And so it's developed into something that even now that is just to bless people, and it's grown beyond anything I can even conceive of. But that's what ministry is.
And we're hoping for a book to come out of that. We're hoping for a couple different things that you have in the
coming
works.
out of it. In fact, even
things that you probably hadn't even thought of were on the radar.
Well, here's the thing that people need to understand. If anybody would have ever told me that I would write a book, and if you'd ever seen my scores in English, but the kingdom of God is such that little did we know when we made this transition I had no clue. I just started to do some things. And that's the adventure. And I'm just glad that adventure has taken me. And in fact, possibly in the studio and the things that you've done, you have done some things, and we're doing here as a pilot, and just something that you want to do, that you're gifting, is that this may be an avenue that we can use and bless others with, even here using the studios here at New Hope, and no telling what can happen. So there's a dream that you've got. So hopefully we're helping to birth a dream of being able to speak to people in ministry and even outside ministry to impact them in a positive way.
And I think in ministry, the final just transition thing that's really a big step of faith is a lot of times we ask ourselves the question, what would I even do if I stepped out of this, or if I move on to what God has next for me? I don't even know what that is. It's not. A truth would be mindful Christianity today is reaching far more people.
The reach is the literally millions of people are on Facebook, and it's the scope of it is beyond. It's
your interactions on mindful Christianity today and things that you post,
comparison.
Comments, all of that far exceeds anything that we're doing currently here at New Hope. So God uses you in a huge way,
and
this
that's
ministry.
what I guess the dream is that just keep pursuing and be faithful to God, and hopefully somehow God will, to be truthful, that I'm at the place now that I was retired, and I don't want to start another job again, but there's opportunities to reach out because people are always hurting. And as long as we keep ministry, the concern of bringing Christ to people and bringing the life of God, that, the suffering Messiah died for us, and that we can relate to him, and there's hope, and that we can learn that. But I'm excited about what's going on here. This is a great example of the difference in the giftings that showed that why God brought you into this place at New Hope, and the things and the staff people that you've got for a future I still think has, nobody knows, but just keep doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being on.